Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're watching Season 3, Episode 6 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode was recorded on May 16th, 2025. I'm your host, Jim Lawless. For more information about the show, including the show notes for this episode, please visit straypointers.com. Joining the show tonight is software engineer, text adventure game author, and paleontologist Mike Taylor. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
Mike, I happened upon one of your blogs, and you've got a few, because of your text adventure gaming background. So I'd kind of like to start there. You've got a number of interests that I'd like to talk about tonight, but could we talk about the 80s and 8-bit text adventures, or interactive fiction as it's called now? And it's described to me, what was your introduction to computers and programming in BASIC in that era?
Yeah, it's a friend of mine's his dad ran a small business and he bought a TRS-80 to run the accounts on, which I guess in retrospect you'd look at that and say it's a ridiculous thing to do, but it worked out really well for me. So I got to mess about with computers for the first time because of that. And one of the small number of games that they had on that was the Scott Adams game Adventureland.
Now, did you Adventureland was in BASIC, yes?
No, I think the first version of it was written in BASIC, but by the time the version we had, it was a machine language interpreter and still driven off the same database.
Okay, so you had played an adventure game. When did you start coding in BASIC?
Around the same time, or maybe even slightly before. In fact, before I had seen or touched a computer myself, I seem to remember I got a book out and started writing basic programs out on bits of paper, and against the day that I would one day be able to actually put them in.
And how did you come to know that BASIC was even a thing?
It would have been the same friend. So it's called Miles Kelvin. It's funny enough, he lives in California now. And he and I were very close and did all sorts of computer things together, including some of the first adventure games that I wrote. I wrote together with Miles.
Okay.
So knowing about his dad's computer was, I guess, what first sparked the interest for me.
Okay. Now, on one of your blogs, you mentioned this magazine, Practical Computing, this particular issue, which I believe was March of 1982.
Mm.
And in this issue, there were a couple of things. There was a special on adventure games here, and immediately following that article was a basic adventure game. Now, these are a couple clips from those articles. Did you write your first commercial adventure before seeing this magazine, or was this sort of the catalyst to drive you to write your own?
Do you know, it's so hard to remember now, looking back at it. I do know that I kind of figured out how to do it on my own, not based on anything that was in the magazine. What I remember from the magazine really is just the atmosphere. That's what really stayed with me. And that beautiful, evocative cover with the, I'm sure you registered what's going on. It's like an archaeologist poking around in ruins, little realizing that the ruin is itself a giant computer.
Yeah, it's kind of ominous.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, I guess it is as well. I've never really thought of that, but it's, sort of big R romance, I guess.
Okay. So your first commercial publication, was it Magic Mirror for the VIC-20?
Yeah, that's right. So this was must have been a little while after first playing with the TRS-80, and then the second computer I got to play with was the old PET 2001 that had the chiclet style keys.
Sure.
And that was owned by the father of a boy that my mum used to babysit for. So it was, in those days, it was, if you could get your hand on a computer from a friend of a friend or anything like that, then you would do it. And he was amazing for me. He taught me so much about programming, and he built me a memory expansion for my VIC-20, which I got a bit later. I do literally mean built from RAM chips and board and solder. And he put it in a cassette case to be its housing, and plugged it into my Vic. And that's why Magic Mirror is for a Vic 20 with 8K expansion, because that's what I had.
Now, there's a couple of questions I have about that. First of all, how did I assume you were a teenage boy at this time?
Oh, yeah.
How did a teenage boy connect with a publishing house to get this published?
Combination of arrogance and happenstance. So it was Terminal Software, who were up in Manchester, and they sold games. Obviously, one of them that I liked the look of was a remake of Scramble, the arcade game Scramble, where you fly left to right through a landscape, dropping bombs and shooting things. So in the days of mail order, you just get it by sending them a letter saying, I'd like to buy one of these, here's a check. And in the letter, I said, by the way, I've written my own games, would you like to see them? So it didn't really occur to me that that wasn't a reasonable thing to do.
And they contacted you, and the rest
Yeah,
is history.
yeah, that's right. And they invited me and Miles as well, because I made it clear that he was also programming similar sorts of stuff. Invited us up to a conference in Manchester. A couple of 14-year-old boys got on a train, went to change in London, and we drank beer when we got there. It was just this amazing kind of adult world experience.
It's kind of adventure in itself then.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So now I've seen sales figures on the VIC 20, but
Mm.
I don't know that I've ever seen sales figures on VIC 20s that had 8K expansions or 16K expansions. Did this was there enough were there enough people out there with 8K VIC 20s that this was a game that was selling?
Yeah, I mean, in modern terms, tiny numbers, but I think from that and the follow-up game, which I guess we'll touch on in a minute as well, I seem to remember I made about £700 between the two of them. And then that was enough for me to buy a Commodore 64 and a disk drive, which was a total game changer.
Okay. Now Magic Mirror, was it basic, completely basic, no machine language?
Yeah, that's right.
I'm just curious, did it also run on the pet then?
It would have run on a pet had you loaded it on there. I don't think I ever did it.
Okay. Okay. So
You
so
can.
so then
Because these days you can do it with emulators, of course.
your next commercial game from the same publishing house was Nosferatu for the VIC 20.
Yeah. So that one is very closely based on that first game that Miles and I wrote together on the TRS-80. So obviously it was all retyped and a lot of the details were different, but the sort of broad structure of it derived from that work that we did together.
Okay. And that also ran in 8K with an 8K expansion rather.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you took your money, you got a Commodore 64. Now you've got all sorts of memory, uh, 40 column display. You wrote a program called The Causes of Chaos, but it was released by a different publishing house,
Yeah.
CRL.
Yeah. So I think Terminal had ceased trading by that point, or if not that, then at least they and I were no longer in contact. So after I'd written, it was then called Nemesis at that point. I just took it to a computer show, and I had made, I think, 10 floppy disks with it on. Just took it around to all the companies that looked like they also sold adventure games, and left demos behind and tried to persuade people to play them. So again, it's just not an approach that would possibly work, I think, today. But back in the 80s, that's how it was. I really miss that kind of hobbyist quality to it.
Now, this particular game is mostly basic, you said, but there was some machine code. So
Yeah,
you had started to learn 6502 family of machine code at this time?
I'd always done bits and pieces of machine code, but it's you don't need me to tell you. I think it's very cumbersome for doing anything particularly text based. And because in adventure games speed isn't really a big issue, it always made sense just to do things the easy way and just use machine code for things like where I wanted to have a bit of text scrolling across the screen, or the sprites rolling down with the title page, that kind of thing. Oh, and playing the music.
Okay. How big of a seller was The Causes of Chaos?
Um, do you know, you would think I would know this, wouldn't you? I'm not sure I was ever told numbers. They just sent me some money, and I assumed that they were doing it right. So that's all I really know. But it was into the money was into four figures this time. I think it's something like £1,500,
Okay.
which at the time, again, for a kid who'd not even gone to university yet, that felt like life-changing money.
Now, were there advertisements with these games that were in any magazines or anything like that from either of these publishing houses?
Yeah, funny enough, it just occurred to me yesterday that I ought to go through. Now, of course, on the Internet Archive, they have scans of all the old computer games. I should look
Hmm.
through and see if I can find the adverts. Yeah, I mean, they weren't extensively advertised, but they were in there.
By the way, I should mention that practical computing issue is available on the Internet Archive. That's where I got those stills from. So I've got
Yeah,
the whole issues available.
it's just the
Um,
most amazing resource. That.
so let me ask. So you're a teenager and you're a published game author. Did this become known to your friends at school?
Yeah, I think so. In a small way, it wasn't like being a film star or anything.
Okay. What, so there was no prestige associated with it at school or in your
I
circle of
wasn't
friends?
aware of any. No.
Okay.
I mean, at that point at school, I guess everybody was getting seriously into rock music, and the prestige was for people who could play guitar in bands and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Did you use the same types of game engines across these three games? The approaches to the way that I think you'd said you'd used parallel linear arrays, which was kind of common on
Yeah.
some of these adventures to simulate an array of data structures for the rooms and that sort of thing. But the game engines, the parsers, that sort of thing, was that common between the three, or did it evolve? Did they evolve, or how did that work?
Yeah, that was pretty much the same. So, I mean, calling it an engine would be over dignifying it. There was no kind of reusable hunk of code in a separate database. But I figured out how I was going to represent locations and exits and objects and where they were and the rest of it. That stayed pretty much the same between them. Parsing, we're not talking about infocom type parsing where you understand things like take all the plants except the rows and put them in the Wellington boot.
Okay.
It's just a matter of figuring out what's the verb, what's the noun. And ultimately, although you could type more complex sentences, it would just come down to those two things, the verb and noun.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's pretty easy to rewrite from scratch each time I needed it.
Okay. So I know you wrote some other text adventures, but they weren't published commercially. Did you attempt to publish anything further?
Yeah, I think the other three that were finished and in a state to be published, I seem to recall I sent them all to Terminal Software, and I think then what I said earlier about them going out of business, I think that must be right because that will be why they didn't publish them.
Okay.
Of course, all of this is more than 40 years ago, so the details are not
Sure.
as in my mind as they should be.
Sure.
But yeah,
Okay.
the last of those was written for an incredibly powerful machine, a VIC-20 with a 16K expansion. And I didn't have one of those. I was never able to afford it, but I borrowed one from someone at school and used that to write the game.
Okay. How did your progression as a programmer then continue beyond basic and assembly and 6502 assembly language?
Well, so I went to university to study pure maths, and I took a couple of optional units in computer science, and gradually it became apparent to me that pure maths is really hard and computer science is a bit easier. So what I really got into then was the Unix systems, time sharing system that was available to all the students. And that became for me just like a giant playground as well as being a social hub. So that's where I did most of my programming then, briefly in Pascal, just because we had to for assignments. But once we got on to C, that very quickly became the language of choice.
So you created a C program called Mundi,
Yeah,
which is it sounds like a Latin word. Is that Latin for something?
it is. It's the Latin word for world, which obviously is what it's trying to represent. But it's
Okay.
also something like multi-user networked dungeon interaction.
Okay. Okay. This while you were at the university?
Yeah, that's right. Warwick University.
And you wrote this in C.
Hmm.
Was this like what became known, excuse me, was this like what became known as a MUD, a multi-user dungeon?
It was a MUD, but the original MUD was written at Essex University some years before that, and I
Okay.
kind of that in mind as an inspiration, I guess, when I was building Mundi.
And you believe that Mundi was the first internet chat program? Some sub-function in Mundi was actually one of the first available user-to-user internet chats?
I think it was, yeah. It predates IRC, so it's as with all these multi-user games, you can actually do game stuff, but people spend a lot of their time just chatting because it ran over internet domain sockets rather than some local mechanism. We did have some people connecting from other universities, so who knows whether that was a first, but it was certainly early on and that kind of thing happening.
Okay. So then you had progressed into other languages such as Ruby and Perl?
Well, that's a bit later. So let's see now. So my first proper job was almost all the programming was in C and an in-house language. But then I moved on in 2000 and Perl was the main language we used there. And that I've found, I describe it as a hard language to love, but so easy to like. It's, it lacks elegance, but it's just so useful.
And you're a Perl developer now primarily, yes?
No. I do a bit of Perl still, but mostly at the moment I'm writing JavaScript and Go.
Okay. Okay. So tell me a little bit then about how you came about doing code in Perl. I see a number of Perl example programs on your blog.
Let's see now. So I was working for a company that it wasn't a startup, but it was kind of functioning as a startup and trying to get into and take over the market of selling tickets for big events. We did the ticketing for Tottenham Hotspur for a while. So a lot of that was to do with getting things just done quickly and in a way that I suppose you would look at it today and say, well, we didn't have unit tests or any of the other engineering stuff, but it was a matter of making stuff work fast. And Perl, I think, even now remains the best language for a lot of that kind of stuff.
Okay. Okay. Let's take a departure from the coding side of your interests. I understand you have an interest in paleontology.
Yeah. So I hope every kid loves dinosaurs, but for some reason I can't really explain. When I hit about 30, that passion started to come back. So by that point, there was a dinosaur mailing list on the internet, which I joined, and that was just brilliant because it was a kind of big melting pot of hobbyists like myself, but also professionals. So I started reading the formal publications in the field. And after a while, I reached a point where I looked at some of those and thought, I could do better than that.
Okay. So you've written about some of these I'll call them dinosaurs, but they're the skeletal remains of these dinosaurs, and
Yeah.
you've actively photographed some of these skeletons. How did you get into the photography aspect of it?
It's just necessary for publication and also for understanding what you're looking at. So, because my day job is programming, I'm not funded to do paleontology. I get to go to a museum with a good collection maybe once a year at best. So it really is a matter of just hoovering up all the data I possibly can, photos and sometimes videos, lots of measurements, lots of sketches and books. And then I kind of feed off that as my raw data for the research work I do for the year following on from that.
Now I understand you got a recent paper on is it about a diplodocus?
Oh, I'm so pleased about that one. It's been 3 years in the making, and it's about the Carnegie Diplodocus, which is probably the single best known dinosaur specimen in the world.
Okay.
So, obviously, the original skeleton's in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, but in the early 1900s, the museum sent out replicas around the world. So there are copies in London and Paris and Berlin and Vienna and Mexico City and La Plata and Moscow. So millions and millions of people have seen this animal, but so little is really known about it because it was all done in a rush in days before we'd really settled into what the science of paleontology should look like, and notes weren't taken. So it's been this huge research project, and it's involved a bunch of co-authors, and a lot of other people have helped track down obscure documents. And so just to get to the end of that, it came out about a week ago. It's just been a really glorious moment.
Very good. Now he's got a nickname, does he not?
Oh, yeah, people call him Dippy. I hate that.
Okay. Well, we'll forget
About
that part.
lacking elegance.
Okay. What
Yeah.
what's next on your list of paleontological adventures then?
There's in the American Museum of Natural History, in the big atrium, the first built room you walk into, and you walk in there. There's a rearing skeleton of Barosaurus, which is another dinosaur closely related to Diplodocus, big body, very long neck. And I'm doing a similar job on that again with other co-authors. That was mounted in 1991, I want to say. And again, nothing really was written about it scientifically at the time. So it's a matter of going through what documentation survives, including like technical drawings and notes that the curators had, and stuff that was published in the popular press, and just figuring out, okay, what actually was this? What went into it? Because it's not all Barosaurus bones, some of it's Diplodocus, which is what led me to doing the Diplodocus paper. So again, it's these things, they just so sprawl out of control, and I begin them thinking, well, a couple of weeks I should be able to write this up, and then 3 years pass.
Okay. Okay. So longtime programmer, paleontologist. You're also a book author.
Yeah, kind of. So I don't know. It's cheating to call myself that, I think, because the book you're talking about, the 11th Doctor, it's about Doctor Who, is largely assembled from stuff I'd already written on the blog. So there are some extra chapters, there are some revisions, but that's where the bulk of it came from.
Okay, so you have a book on the 11th Doctor. Why the 11th Doctor?
It's just because I love him so much. So we had children who were just the right age to start watching Doctor Who when it relaunched in 2005. So I suppose initially my wife and I watched it just with them, but I found there's something exhilarating about how Doctor Who done well just has all the brakes off, and it can do anything, any kind of story in any setting. It can be wildly ambitious.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like the 11th Doctor, that was Matt Smith, really lent into that in a way that I hadn't seen before or since, sadly, I have to say. And there's
Now,
something very magnetic about how, in the most cataclysmic and bizarre situations, he would still be very relatably, I was going to say human. Of course, he's actually Time Lord, not human. But you know what I mean? There's a
yep.
real essence of an empathetic person there. So I think that juxtaposition is what really drew me to him.
Had you been a Doctor Who fan before the Chris Eccleston reboot?
I was, yeah, back in the old days, collected the little cutout monster figures on the back of the shredded wheat packets, and in the fading days of John Pertwee. Yeah.
Okay. Who's what do you think of the actors that followed on in the after the 11th Doctor, those different incarnations?
Well, I was really excited about. Oh, my mind's gone blank. What was he called? The older guy, 12th
The
Doctor.
the 12th Doctor? Oh,
Yeah,
now you've got me.
he was best known for the thick of it, wasn't he? Well, oh, Peter Capaldi, of course.
There we go.
But I really like the idea of an older Doctor and maybe getting back a bit more to the roots of what Doctor Who was like. I imagine him being more kind of irascible, and but although there are some great episodes in his run, I feel like that character didn't really land for me in the way I'd hoped, and it felt to me like he was trying to be an older man taking the role of one of the younger Doctors. So I was a little disappointed. And then Jodie Whittaker, I'm afraid, I feel she's just always trying to do a David Tennant impression, and she's been saddled with terrible scripts thanks to Chris Chibnall as well. So I honestly, I ran out of steam, and I haven't even managed to finish watching her episodes. I'm halfway through Flux, and it's on my to-do list. But the very fact that I need to have it on a to-do list rather than just wanting to watch the episodes, I guess, tells its own story.
So have you
So
watched any of the current series with Shooty?
no, I'm really looking forward to that. But my completionist streak won't let me do that till I've finished trudging through Jodie Whittaker.
Gotcha.
Well, what do you think of him?
Well, it's a different take, and I think some episodes are better than others. So I think if he's coupled with the right writer with the right story, things work out. For me, the Doctor Who stories, there would sometimes be this unusual solution to a problem
Mm,
that was just seemed to be contrived to me. And that goes from I started with the John Pertwee era. We got
mm,
John Pertwee on PBS over here, when led into Tom Baker, and it sort of dropped out when the others followed until Chris Eccleston was kind of a reboot. So I had I've gone back and I've seen William Hartnell and the ones that predate Pertwee, but usually if there was some sort of a contrived solution to a problem where the doctor in just a moment figures out that, oh, it's all in his psyche, and if we do this and do that, and boom, and all of a sudden everything's solved, that just seemed to be an unsatisfying ending for some episodes, and I can't cite anything, but my particular favorites are John Pertwee and Tom Baker. And my particularly favorite arc would probably have to be The Talons of Weng Chiang with Tom Baker. And I've
So
got that on DVD here, and I pull it out from time to time.
I know it's widely liked, but of course it's got two big problems, hasn't it? The rat and the racism. But
Yes,
I
yes.
don't
Yeah.
know how you reconcile yourself with that.
Well, it's uncomfortable to watch. It's I'll read old comics where the sidekick is usually an Asian or an Indian or something like that, and it's very they're all cringeworthy,
Yeah.
and it's hard to believe that at that time we just sort of it just sort of went by and I don't know who noticed it at the time, but yeah, that absolutely is present in that particular art.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't covered?
Hmm. Well, I mean, it's your podcast. You know what subjects are of interest to your listeners. I
Both of them, yeah.
suppose fundamentally, I'm just interested in everything. So, you mentioned I've got multiple blogs. One of them, the Reinvigorated Programmer, started
Hmm.
out as a blog, but it's just ended up being what I write everything on. So if it's political philosophy or a recipe that I've come up with or a critique of a film that I've seen, it all just turns up there, and I everything's interesting, right?
Well, Mike, now on the masthead for your blog, you've got a picture that's a collage,
Mm,
and on the leftmost side is the band Deep Purple, followed by on as you progress to the right, it's a Commodore Pet,
yeah,
a Trez Sushi, the
yeah.
12th Doctor, and Clara,
Mm,
his companion, I think the prior Doctor's companion too. Um,
yeah.
what is the significance? We've talked about the Doctor Who side and the pet. Deep Purple and Sushi. What are the significances of those in your interests?
When I first started the blog, I wanted to give it some visual interest. So I just found myself putting a photo of a piece of sushi in every post that I did for the first year or two. So it's always been a theme of the blog, even when I'm not writing about it. But Deep Purple, I guess, stood in for when I did I think 24-part series on the origins of heavy metal. So going right back to the kind of proto metal of people like the Kinks with "You Really Got Me" and the Beatles singing "Helter Skelter," and then obviously the kind of the big moments of when it started to become something like the genre would recognize now were around about the time of Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. So I put Deep Purple in the banner at that point, just as a kind of a marker for that whole series. And they've just stayed there out of sheer laziness. I really ought to redo the banner at some point.
Is that another book in the making?
I don't think so. I don't think there's quite enough there for a book. I
Okay.
have wondered about doing something similar to the origins of progressive rock, which is the music I really love, and then maybe the two of those together, or even kind of woven through each other, might make something more like a book.
Okay. Well, Mike, I appreciate your time this afternoon. Afternoon for you, morning for me.
Yeah,
And it's been great talking with you.
thank you. It's been so much fun.
Thank you all for watching today's show. Let's do this again soon. Take care.